Hello, class. I want to talk to you about building rapport. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher of the 4th century BC, wrote a groundbreaking work on communication theory called Rhetoric. And in this work, he says that more important than the logos of a speech, the content of the speech, is the ethos or character of the speaker, as well as the pathos, the empathy of the speaker. What Aristotle was getting at is the importance of building rapport between the speaker and the audience. And it's not just the content, it's something about the speaker that instigates this building of rapport. We live in a day when suspicions run high toward leaders in business, politics, and the church. So building rapport between speaker and audience has never been more necessary and more challenging than it is today. The sermon introduction has to begin the process of building rapport between the preacher and the congregation. If not, the preacher may not ever get heard, no matter how interesting or engaging or entertaining the introduction. So whether you're the familiar guest speaker at some kind of event or the pastor of a local church, there are a few practical things you can do to build rapport early on in the sermon. Here are a couple tips to build rapport with the people to whom you preach. First off, commend the crowd. Parenting experts, perhaps an oxymoron, will say that parents should be as quick to tell our kids what they're doing right as we are to correct what they're doing wrong. These experts say that commending our kids actually builds them up to receive correction when we give it. And the same is true for preachers who are addressing a group of people. We should be as quick to commend the group as we are to challenge the group with our message. So, for example, if you're the guest speaker at an event, come up with something you can say positive about the group. Commend them for their hospitality, or commend them for what they're doing in the community, or commend them for their core values that you resonate with. If you're the pastor of a local church, find a way to commend your people in a way that sort of ties into the message you're preaching that morning. Of course, you want to be honest, right? You don't want to just tell your wife she looks good in that dress if she really doesn't. So when you're commending a crowd, be honest. Don't lie, but just find something good to say. It builds rapport. Another way to build rapport is use self-deprecating humor. One of the ironies of public speaking is that the less seriously we preachers take ourselves, the more intently people tend to listen to us. That seems odd, doesn't it? Remember, the Apostle Paul was very quick to admit his weaknesses, humorously pointing out and criticizing his lack of eloquence and his poor eyesight in order that the message of the cross of Christ might have prominence. The people to whom we preach are measuring our level of egotism, and if they sniff out pride and egotism in us, they'll stop listening to us. One of the ways we get around that is using self-deprecating humor and using that kind of humor in a way that's natural, wise, and sparing. And I think self-deprecating humor, done well, can give the people to whom we preach the impression that we don't view ourselves as one above them, but as one among them. And I think this goes a long way in building rapport. And we got to be careful not to overdo it. Our use of humor should not come from a position of insecurity, but from one of security in Christ. So don't overdo it. Use it sparingly. So commend the crowd, use self-deprecating humor. Another tip for building rapport is be brutally honest. While the gospel of Jesus Christ is good news, it is bad news first. And before people even reach out for Christ, they have to face the bad news that we are a sinful, broken, needy people, and that life is not fair, and it's often lonely and empty. And it's not until a preacher is honest about the bad news, the painful realities that all of us experience, that they won't be heard when they share the good news. So if your preaching tends to sugarcoat the angst and suffering of the human condition, people will quit listening to you, I think, today, and they'll conclude that this preacher is living in la la land and has no idea what it's like to live in the real world, my world, where life doesn't always come up roses, where junk happens all the time. Preachers are especially guilty of this at funeral messages, one of the places where we've got to build rapport quickly. I think sometimes we preachers at funeral messages are so quick to console the grieving that we never sort of name death for what it is. Death stinks. Life is cruel. Life is painful. And so it's very important for us to be brutally honest about the junk, the bad news of the human condition and life and death. Of course, the preacher has to be just as honest about the good news, too, even when the realities of the human condition attempt to veil the hope of the gospel. So, be brutally honest. Commend the crowd. Use self-deprecating humor. Be brutally honest. A fourth tip for building rapport is demonstrate passionate conviction. One of the most essential ways to build rapport with the people to whom you preach is to communicate as if you really believe you have something important to say, something life-giving. And this can't really be faked. I mean, we try to fake it, right? We write in our sermon notes, laugh now, or, cry now, or my favorite, strain your voice and whisper so people think you have passion. But passionate conviction is really hard to fake, and it grows out of a real, genuine, intimate connection with Christ that surfaces in the form of passionate love for people. There have been times when I've gotten up to preach and did not feel a whole lot of passionate conviction for the message I was about to proclaim. I trust that God still used it, but one of the reasons I have you isolate the sermon focus and function is for you to get a chance to sort of step back and say, can I preach this message with passionate conviction? Do I believe this? Is this important? Is this urgent? Is this compelling enough to preach? And if not, you sort of discard that and come up with another sermon focus that's congruent with the exegetical work you've done. Simply put, passion is stirred in the preacher when the sermon has obvious potential to both glorify God and liberate people in significant ways. Fifth and finally, scratch their itch. You build rapport with people when you scratch their itch. Harry Emerson Fosdick, the famous preacher of New York City's Riverside Church, once said something like, "No one comes to church to find out what happened to the Jebusites except the preacher." Fosdick was humorously advising preachers to avoid the pet issues that are important to them, but not so important to the people to whom we preach. He said preachers need to, in the introduction, build rapport with people by communicating they know where people are itching. So often we preachers are guilty of sort of scratching where people are not itching. If I ask my wife to scratch my back, she doesn't scratch my belly, and yet we preachers do that all the time. We do this in two ways, I think. First, in the introduction, we often raise questions that people aren't asking, and that diminishes our rapport right away as people start to daydream about the stuff that really matters to them, like what they're going to eat for lunch. The second way we commit this crime of scratching where people are not itching is by raising a significant question in the introduction of the sermon, and yet never answering that question, never scratching that itch that we raise. And I think that second crime is worse than the first, because people are set up and built up for disappointment. So a word to wise preachers: make sure your sermon introduction not only raises good questions, raises the itch, but then addresses the itch throughout the sermon. So, which one of the 5 tips for building rapport do you most resonate with? Or maybe it comes most naturally to you. And which one do you least resonate with, or does not come naturally to you? Is it commend the crowd, use self-deprecating humor, be brutally honest, demonstrate passionate conviction, or scratch their itch? Go ahead and reply to that question in this post. Which one comes least naturally to you, and which one of those 5 comes most naturally to you? Thanks.